Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Anya Barkin. I am the programming co-lead for CLF Toronto. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Thank you for Lara for coming in to sharing this important information with us. Lara is the Director of Sustainability with Kirkor Architects and Planners, and her presentation will be on Know Your Impact Findings and Outcomes from the Carbon Coalition Conference. Before we start the presentation, I'll just do some housekeeping and just some information about Carbon Leadership Forum, and then we'll kick off the presentation. Oh, sorry. Okay, so Carbon Leadership Forum, we are the Toronto region for CLF. CLF, our focus is all about embodied carbon and reducing the embodied carbon in building materials and construction through collective action. We are a group, we bring together all people from all sectors within the industry, so including architects, engineers, consultants, material suppliers, building owners, and policymakers and contractors together to really tackle embodied carbon as a collective. Just starting with the land acknowledgement, as a Toronto-based group, we acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'll just do a quick plug for our upcoming events. We have 2 events coming up in May. I'll bring your attention right away to the QR code. So the QR code, if you scan it right now, you'll go to the registration page for this event. So it's going to be a total of 2 webinars that we're going to be hosting in May, and it's really going to be highlighting our 2024 Ontario Embodied Carbon Award winners. So for each webinar, we're going to be highlighting 3 award winners. For May 14th, it will be presentations from the Windmill Development Group, Policies and Programs, the Walhalla Phase 1 project, and then the headquarters for Flatiron Building Group. And then the second one, again, note that there's a QR code for the registration page. So the second one will be on May 21st. And the 3 projects that will be highlighted will be the Rotary Health Center at Camp Kawartha, the Seed Building Systems, and the BDP Quadrangle Studio. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you come up with any questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them into the chat. Recommended to use speaker view for best viewing experience. Please keep your video and audio off, and just note that this session is being recorded and there will be a recording available after the session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Laura, and please take it over. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Anya. Thanks so much to the CLF team for inviting me. I'm very excited to be able to share a lot of the incredible discussions, conversations, investigations, research, and so much more that was sort of brought forward through this conference, and also in the discussions before and after the conference. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here, and then we'll get started. Okay, hoping everybody is able to see the screen, and I'll start with that. So yes, as Anya was mentioning, today's webinar is really talking about those important discussions from the Carbon Coalition Conference, and I wanted to be able to sort of provide a quick breakdown for everybody, just as it relates to some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Just a quick introduction on what the conference is, what Carbon Coalition is about, Really important to be able to quickly run through some terms as it relates to EPDs, embodied carbon, etc. A lot of these things you guys already know, so I won't be sort of diving into too much detail on it, but I think it's still important to be able to highlight. And then we're really going to be diving into the details as it relates to the findings from the discussions, but specifically what those sector-specific challenges are, as well as the opportunities, and really looking at what each of those sectors are talking about. So industry manufacturers, private sector representatives, public sector representatives, what were they all talking about? What were their challenges? Were there any overlaps? Was there any sort of chicken and egg situations? And what were the sort of solutions that were discussed, possible solutions that were discussed to be able to kind of address that? So a little bit of a teaser there. And then, of course, there's a small segment just as it relates to key takeaways. I've sort of framed it as a general overview, certainly, but if you'd like to be able to kind of discuss specifics for each respective sector, be happy to be able to kind of jump in on those details as well. So a little bit on what Carbon Coalition is. So Carrefour Architects and Planners essentially founded Carbon Coalition early in 2024, really in an effort to connect industry experts to develop holistic strategies. And holistic strategies is really important as we wanted to be able to apply that in the sort of decarbonization realm in addressing what those strategies are for reducing embodied carbon in buildings, and that being through education and being through advocacy. So I say holistic because the definition is really important, and I'm actually going to quote it here. It's the belief that the parts of something are interconnected and can be explained only by reference to the whole. So if we sort of apply that mentality and concept of holistic thinking, we can, which really involves all the sectors, we're actually going to be able to have more comprehensive strategies for decarbonization, and they're that much more consolidated. So really our mission is basically defined by 3 points that you see on the screen there. The first is really pertaining to bridging the information gaps, just as it relates to the need for carbon data through EPDs, but also to be able to better understand what that overall carbon footprint actually is within the very buildings that we design, at least for architects, but also for approvals from policymakers, but also as it relates to the builders and those who are actually living in it. So there is a big rush to be able to bridge those information gaps. And that's really going to be sort of evolved and discussed in the next couple of slides, a lot of which we already know, but a good kind of a recap that we're going to be looking at. So the second being understanding what those challenges are. Those are really the main pieces that we want to be able to identify as our mission. So in order to be able to understand those challenges, it requires all of us to be able to be in constant communication, and specifically in looping in industry manufacturers. That is one of the key target groups or audiences that we want to be able to outreach and bring into the fold. Discussions with manufacturers are, of course, certainly happening, but we really feel that there needs to be that much more of a discussion. So a lot of the work that we've done in the full year of 2024 was really actually manufacturer engagement and outreach. So understanding what those challenges are from each respective sector, but especially manufacturers, is really an important sort of component to who we are and what we'd like to be able to resolve. And then, of course, it's all about aligning those efforts and addressing those impacts. So we know that both private and public sector representatives are really the drivers for this information that we're trying to be able to resolve and sort of conclude on. But industry change is not possible without industry. And that was something that I sort of highlighted at the conference, and certainly enjoy highlighting all the more because it really is a very important piece. So what was the conference specifically about? There were 5 main objectives, 3 of which we've already sort of covered, which is basically part of the mission and vision of the Carbon Coalition. But there were also a few others that I want to be able to highlight here, and that they were really focusing in on 2 components. The first being from theory to practice, so really being able to translate the theory of embodied carbon into practice through the realities of construction. That's really an important piece. The realities of construction, the realities of manufacturing, the realities of planning, design, etc. This is all sort of the fundamentals that we wanted to be able to address. It's not just sort of a discussion as it relates to the overall thinking of what embodied carbon is, but how do we actually implement it? That implementation factor is really quite important. And then the other piece is really just looking at what are all the questions that we have. If we're able to answer the right questions and have all the questions in front of us, that is really the main piece to be able to define what those answers would be, define what those solutions could possibly be. So one thing that I highlighted specifically in the conference is to say that we may not actually get all the answers that day. And honestly, that's okay. It's not necessarily the overall intent of the conference. Rather, it's about wondering and understanding what we're trying to find to be the issues of decarbonization within each of our respective sectors. If we're able to find that out, we'll be able to kind of create those solutions tailored and specific to those sector-specific challenges. So who was in attendance? We had a number of architects, a number of developers, and a number of industry manufacturers as well that I want to be able to highlight in there, which I'll show again in the next couple of slides. But really, you'll see the breadth and scope of private and public sector engagement is really quite an important piece to us. We wanted to be able to sort of loop in as many people involved in the actual creation, approval, and development and build out or construction of a project. So really looking at engineers, looking at policymakers, of course, and also third-party organizations. We were very lucky to have Anna Wang join us that day from CLF. We had CAGBC join us as well, and also spoke specifically focusing in on our industry manufacturers. You'll see that I've highlighted there on that screen that it's not just the manufacturers that we're looping in, but we were very keen on and really sort of focused in on bringing in the product distributors, if there were any suppliers that would be able to join, but also looking at that industry associations as well as industry councils. And this was really important because that would allow you to sort of create a sort of a scale of industry, right? So the scale of operation is very important to be able to understand because you'll know what the needs are for those respective individuals and manufacturers of the single company, scaled up to the actual consortium of manufacturers and what the members of the industry associations are finding overall. So being able to look at that scale of individual to consortium of manufacturers was really an important element. And we were very pleased to be able to have those manufacturers in attendance. But what kind of manufacturing, what kind of products did we actually have as representatives of these product manufacturers at our table at these conference in particular? And you'll see we've actually sort of done a visual diagram of this, and we really wanted to be able to highlight that day and the conference that it's not just of a particular material, but rather all the inner workings and outer workings to actually create and build a building. So everything from your concrete to your steel to your roofing and waterproofing, even down to your sealants and interiors. This was really understanding the full range of products that are used to build a building, top to bottom, inside and out. So as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, when I was introducing this, I think it's really important to be able to understand before we get into the findings, some of the key terms that are going to be used in this presentation, because I'm going to be referencing a lot of these acronyms and whatnot, and I think it's just important to be able to get that out there. And I know a lot of you who are listening are very well versed in this, so I won't dive into it too much. But really the intention is a lot of the policies that we're seeing in the legislation that we're seeing, which we'll talk about in a bit, are really understanding or working towards understanding what the embodied carbon value is of our particular projects, right? So understanding what those carbon emissions are associated to the materialities as well as the construction processes of our projects. So in order to actually quantify that, we need to be able to have some sort of a document that illustrates what that carbon value is. So in order to develop an EPD, we need to actually understand what the LCA is. So again, it's sort of a documentation of and a means of understanding and tracking what those materials are, what those environmental impacts are, among many other things, throughout the life cycle of an actual product. So that is helping us to understand specifically a particular environmental impact, which is our GWP. In short terms, it's basically the embodied carbon value of that product. So just keeping those things in mind. But again, at the end of the day, that document that we're looking for is the EPD. So an EPD informs what the embodied carbon value is, which is why a lot of the legislation that we're seeing is requiring life cycle assessment reports. They're requiring outlining the need for EPDs and highlighting what they are for those particular projects. So there's certainly an increase in market demand just as it relates to the need for EPDs. And again, one of the important discussions in our outreach program that we had last year with these manufacturers was really in understanding what their specific needs are. So one of the things that they made very clear and quite consistently across the board was, who is asking for this information? Why are they asking for this information? When is it coming down the pipe? What's all the hubbub about an EPD? So really one of the key things we wanted to be able to identify in the conference was to be able to answer those specific questions, which was quite a common sort of theme amongst many of the manufacturers that we spoke with. They know what EPDs are, and some of which actually have EPDs, and those that don't sort of still share the same sort of thinking as it relates to those that do, just on why is there this incredible push for EPDs. So this increasing market demand was something that was clearly communicated to the manufacturers in attendance, and even those that might not necessarily be in industry manufacturing, just to kind of do a bit of a refresh on it. Just as it relates to the corporate objectives from a lot of the developers that we see working with in our own respective field, but also as it relates to the legislation, right? The levels of government that's actually passing policy as it relates to what those requirements are for embodied carbon. There's also another component to this, which is really focusing in on certifications and designations of these particular sort of goals, like LEED, like others, to be able to ensure that embodied carbon reporting is being quantified and is being executed, so that that particular project would be LEED certified or whatever certified. It's really very important to be able to identify. So a lot of them are actually incorporating these requirements for EPDs and data sort of reporting. That's really a key contributor. And the other important discussion point is, which I'm going to touch on in the next few slides, is, is this really a requirement? Is this really something that is just a want to have versus a need to have? And really it is. It is something that is going to be a need and a requirement, as the NBC is sort of outlining in the next couple of iterations, in the 2030 version at least, that this is actually going to include embodied carbon limits. So there is a real need for this. The other piece is having to do with benefits beyond the market demand. So just as it relates to what the manufacturer and product transparency is, it's really important to understand that there's actually a need beyond the market demand. So thinking about your marketing, thinking about your promotion, thinking about understanding what those material libraries actually are, how your product can then be displayed and outlined on material libraries, and even specifically your specifications. Again, this is something I'm going to be speaking about in the next few slides, just as it relates to the importance of specifications. But another really interesting component to this is actually having an opportunity to identify and pinpoint those hotspots for greater optimization and improvement within your actual overall manufacturing of that particular product that you're doing. So all of these things combined was really an opportunity to kind of answer that who, why, when, and where. So super quickly, I know a lot of you already know about this, but I think it's important to also identify that there are different types of EPDs, because this sort of typology of EPDs is one that we'll also be discussing in the next few slides, what the benefits are of each, what the maybe drawbacks are, if any. But there is a landscape of EPDs. So those product-specific EPDs, ideally the most sort of accurate form, third-party certified form of an EPD. It's particular to an actual manufacturer, their plant, as well as to a particular product. So it's really very important to be able to understand that product-specific EPD is the idealized version of it. Industry-wide EPD is a bit different as it relates to basically being developed by an industry associations, or sort of declaring the average of all those products between all those different manufacturers that are actually producing a similar product. So they're not exactly the same, but they are within the same family of products, let's say. So that industry-wide EPD requires some sort of an agreement amongst all the manufacturers to be able to say, yep, we're comfortable with these PCRs. We're comfortable to be able to make an average or sort of overall industry-wide EPD. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit just as it relates to the pros and cons of each. So one thing that we also wanted to be able to highlight, which came in through another specific presentation from one of our third-party verifiers, was really understanding the process of making an EPD. Again, a lot of the feedback that we were receiving from the manufacturers is they just don't know how the process actually is taken. What does it mean? What does the timeline associated to that? And I'm really giving a lot of advance notifications as to what this stuff we're going to find from the actual overall discussions. But I think it was really important to be able to identify how you actually create an EPD. So one specific segment, in addition to the previous segment on the vision and importance of EPDs, which we've just covered, was actually looking at the process of making the EPD. So it's really brought on by a series of steps. The first being your program operator. They are essentially the ones that are actually managing the development and the subsequent publications, not only of your EPDs, but of your PCRs. So what are PCRs? In short, it's essentially a set of rules that are outlining how you actually conduct your life cycle assessment. If you remember, the life cycle assessment is that opportunity to be able to understand those environmental impacts and et cetera about that particular product. So understanding all those things is really very important, because if you have a specific PCR, it's going to be able to inform what your overall EPD is. And we'll find out in the next few slides that there's actually a lot of discussions and concerns about PCRs. The other piece to this is actual data collection. Data collection was really very important because it allows you to be able to understand how much raw materials, how much of the resources that are being consumed in the creation of your product, and how much waste is actually being quantified in order for you to be able to produce the LCA. So that's really your next step, is actually conducting the life cycle assessment. Again, the choice of the program operator and product category rule, I do want to just insert this note, will determine what that specific data is that you will need to be able to collect. The other important piece is that there's the background report that needs to be done for your EPD. It basically provides sort of additional details about the life cycle assessments and the methodologies that have been applied, I should say. What were the assumptions? What were the approaches to be able to actually get that information through, and then subsequently being supported through the third-party verification. And that leads me to the next point. Third-party verification is very, very important. Every EPD needs to be verified and by an independent third-party verifier. This ensures that there's accuracy, that there's reliability in the information, but also to ensure that you actually are able to have your EPD conform with the PCR. So that's really important. And finally, there's EPD publication, which is very simply, you submit the EPD and the document actually gets published, not just through the program operator, but also is actually processing and registering that EPD data and information for publication. So this process that we're seeing here is actually going to then inform the visual sort of diagram that we had worked on to kind of visually illustrate what all the feedback was. So I know it's quite small depending on the size of your screen, but don't worry, I'm going to be walking you through each and every single one of these points, at least at a high level, to be able to sort of show you what the roadmap of discussions were. But you can kind of see that overall this map is essentially what we're calling an embodied carbon living map or an EC living map. And honestly, as part of the sort of overall summarization of all the findings and discussions that we've had, I personally was finding that it was getting very, very wordy in the report that we're actually going to be summarizing from this conference and publishing in the next few weeks, if not the month of May. But the easiest way to be able to actually map out and chart all these things was through a visual aid. And this sort of decarbonization map, this embodied carbon living map, was really an important component to this. So if you remember the process for making an EPD, those 7 sort of points from your program operator to your actual EPD publication, that's these guys that you see here. Those actually became the foundation for the map. These are basically sort of quoted as being topics. They're basically 10 topics. Those are the ones that are in the white, that are the larger sort of bubbles that you see on the screen there. There's also 4 sections. These are basically those larger colored nodes that you see on the screen there. And there's also 4 subsections, which are these smaller colored nodes here. And then there's actually about 70 nodes. Nodes are essentially these individual bubbles that you see. And depending on the size of the bubble is really depending on how many people have actually voiced this concern. So the smaller the bubble is, only a few people actually mentioned it. The larger the bubble was actually more individuals, whether from manufacturing, from public sector, from private sector, actually have outlined it. So it's really quite an important map. But you'll see that the heart of the map is EPD publication. That is the key piece to be able to keep in mind. And that's really the key piece that actually identified the branches of discussion, whether mainly specifically focusing in on industry manufacturers, which is basically everything from this EPD publication to the left, and or sort of discussions that we've had with both industry manufacturers as well as private sector representatives and or public sector representatives, which you'll see is really sort of taken over by the right-hand side of the screen there. So don't worry, I'll walk you through each of these, and we're going to actually start with the EPD process, which I'm sort of calling as part 1, because there's actually quite a lot of information in there. So just to kind of identify what the opportunities were, what were the sort of positives that were being drawn from these discussions. Overall, and generally speaking, from the vast majority of the attendees and from the vast majority of individuals that we've spoken to in our outreach initiative in the lead up to the conference, was that there was an agreement fundamentally that EPDs are a tool for decarbonization. And I really want to be able to highlight that this was not just coming from private sector and public sector. This was feedback from industry manufacturers, which was not only very encouraging, but really a sort of important outline that industry manufacturers who are driving carbon data are on board. They are the ones that are going to continue to be able to push the envelope as it relates to decarbonization with the incredible work that they're doing for their respective products. So the fact that there is an overall, again, majority speaking, an agreement that EPDs are a tool for decarbonization was really very, very important. And also, it's not only important just as it relates to meeting the policy, but also important as it relates to meeting their own goals as a manufacturer for decarbonization, and at the end of the day, being leaders within their respective field on their respective products as it relates to the sustainability component. So those are the positives. What are the actual challenges that they're actually facing? So many of the manufacturers that we've spoken with were finding that it was difficult to be able to actually start the process. So how do I actually begin in creating an EPD? Who do I talk to? What needs to be done? How do I get help in making the EPD? What are in the process of making an EPD? There was also some important discussions on whether or not this was a like to have or a need to have. Again, something that I referenced earlier in the discussion, that some manufacturers that we've spoken with were saying that since this is not necessarily a requirement, I'm not actually going to be able to create something like this. They felt very clear that there's not really a need for it, so I'm not going to actually be able to make the change for it. And speaking of change, a lot of the manufacturers who may not be in the leadership positions, want to be able to get into the decarbonization, and they're having a difficulty in actually translating that back as a communication tool to the leadership within their own manufacturing partners and the sort of leads to say, and the feedback that they've been receiving was really, well, I don't see the need for an EPD. EPDs are not required, and even though if it is required, I don't see a change in the number of projects that we're getting, even though we don't have an EPD. So if there's no change, there's a belief in the leadership in some of these manufacturing companies that there's no reduction in the projects. That was an important piece, and we have to be able to encourage those manufacturers to say, these are the tools you can use to communicate it back with your leadership teams. I want to be able to highlight a few more points on this slide before we continue, that data collection timelines was a huge issue that they were finding. Basically, just to be able to collect all the data and information as part of your LCA takes about 1 year. You need to be able to actually document the number of materials coming in and out of your manufacturing plant, which is about an entire year. We're not even considering the actual process and timelines to create an EPD. So this was really an important piece. Verification was also another interesting discussion. Some manufacturers were mentioning that there is no actual means of verifying what materials are going in and out of the manufacturing plants to be able to ensure that the quantities that you're illustrating within the LCA and as part of your data collection are in fact verified and in fact accurate. There's a couple of other discussions here just as it relates to PCR agreements, PCR expiry, EPD expiry. It's very important to be able to outline that there are expiries for each of these items. EPDs are 5 years, and similarly for PCRs, they do expire as well. But a lot of the feedback that we were receiving is from these manufacturers and doing the industry-wide EPDs, if you guys remember, which is a consortium of manufacturers working together to be able to develop that industry-wide EPD, is that they were finding there to be a lot of difficulty in getting alignment as it relates to what the PCR is to develop your EPD. So some things to keep in mind for that. I also want to be able to quickly highlight the sort of secondary discussions that we had live in real time at that conference when we sat down with two third-party verifiers, José Lepien from Verdima and Mariana Perez from One Click LCA, to be able to identify those specific concerns that we saw being as like the top 6, top 5 concerns that we were finding for manufacturers, and to be able to, through a fireside chat, directly address each and every single one of those. So I've just highlighted some of the top challenges that they've identified. Again, EPD costs and time was a huge factor. I sort of touched on time. As it relates to costing, generally speaking, a lot of the manufacturers were saying that it's super expensive to create an EPD. One of the things our third-party verifiers highlighted is that it's really dependent on the scope of the life cycles that you're actually investigating, your facilities, a number of facilities that you have, the EPD type. So if it's product specific, it should be less expensive. If it's industry wide, it's going to be more expensive because there's going to be a lot more people to speak with. So if you actually understand what all those sort of levers are, choose the appropriate ones that suit your product and the end goal that you have, it might be a little bit more affordable than you think. So that might be just something that needs to be discussed between a manufacturer and a third-party verifier. Funding is also unknown. This was actually quite an interesting discussion. Many manufacturers are aware of funds, but no one actually knows what they are. And there's no actual database that highlights what all those funds and grants are for manufacturers to apply to. So, and those manufacturers that have received funding and/or grants are hesitant to outline what they are to ensure that there's less competition from those other manufacturers in the similar sort of circle to be able to tap into. This is really quite an interesting discussion. I can go on it, but I think there needs to be clear direction on what those funds are, what those grants are, and ensure that it's clear and transparent so that all manufacturers, regardless of what sort of particular product that you're using, can actually apply. Because the more we have EPDs, the better. And if funds are going to help them get there, we should be able to have that clear database. Quickly, PCR applicability. A lot of the manufacturers that we spoke with, again, in our research and outreach initiative in the year 2024, were saying that a lot of PCRs that are available, which is many, many hundreds, if not thousands, they are not finding the appropriate and applicable PCR that actually matches accurately what their product is that they're selling. So for example, if it's a very complex system, like an envelope system, which is comprised of multiple parts, or if it's a very unique system, they're having difficulty in finding what that is. Our third-party verifiers, rather, I should say, specified that it's important to work back with your program operator to ensure that you're finding that appropriate PCR. Super important. Switching suppliers was another important discussion that a lot of the manufacturers were concerned about. They were concerned that if we switch suppliers, that it would mean that they would need to make a new EPD. Third-party verifiers confirmed that unless it's a major change for material and or energy, a redo in your EPD is not required, which I could hear the temperature and the sort of emotions relax a little bit, which is very good, because especially in this sort of political landscape that we're in with the tariffs and everything, again, another item we'll talk about in a minute, this is a very big concern. There was also concerned about proprietary information. How do we protect it? The verifiers actually made clear that proprietary information is not disclosed in the EPD. It is rather found within the LCA, which is not published. So that was a huge help for everybody in that respects. The other important items is looking at EPD limitations and comparability. So this was very important, and if anything, not so much an education moment for those manufacturers who don't have EPDs and don't know what it entails, but actually for the private and public sector representatives. It's really important to be able to know that when you can't actually compare EPDs, you have to understand there's actually a requirement that states in the EPD itself, the limitations of comparing EPDs, because it's dependent on the actual PCR that you're using, it's dependent on the life cycle stages, it's dependent on so many other things. So it's really important to be able to ensure that if you, as a private sector representative or a public sector representative or a manufacturer, that if you are going to be comparing EPDs, you need to make sure that the rules are the same. And again, the rules being your PCR, product category rule. So supply chain, challenges with regards to the supply chain. Supplier information and education and data was a key component that we had found throughout our engagement and consistently throughout the discussions within the conference, that a lot of the suppliers don't actually know what an EPD is, do not have EPDs themselves for their raw materials. And as a result of that, manufacturers need to educate suppliers. Manufacturers need to make estimates themselves from the raw materials that they're choosing. And frankly, those suppliers that don't have actual EPDs, it's really unfortunate, but the manufacturers have to actually then pull industry average EPDs for those particular products that you're utilizing. So it's becoming more and more average information in for them to be able to create an EPD themselves, them being manufacturers. Again, we talked a little bit about supply chain costs, labor costs, production costs. I'm not going to get into that too much because I do want to be able to actually focus in on the locations, materials, tariffs, and then the retooling and interprovincial trade barriers. One important discussion specifically pertaining to tariffs, we actually discussed this back in November last year during the conference. It was a hypothetical at that time. The discussions was to say, you know, tariffs will be difficult, but we don't know what the ripple effect is. We've had subsequent discussions with these same manufacturers and others post-conference to understand how their experiences are with regards to the challenges they're finding in producing their product and producing the EPD as a result of these tariffs. Generally speaking, it's very, very difficult, and there needs to be ways in which we can close certain loopholes as it relates to material supply, which is again sort of touching on the location of materials locally, in order to ensure that they actually have a constant stream of materials that they can use. A lot of the materials that they're using are actually coming from the US, and that's really where tariffs are becoming an issue. So retooling, super quick. Although this was sort of discussed post-conference, again, the feedback from the manufacturers were saying that generally speaking, retooling is possible to do. However, it's going to come at a significant cost, and it's going to take a significant amount of time to be able to retool. The other component to this was the interprovincial trade barriers. You might be hearing this in the news quite consistently. The benefits of it is to ensure that information and or data and or materials and or trades actually go across the country with ease without actually these specific restrictions and or requirements. Generally speaking, from a manufacturer perspective, they actually noted that it's going to have some benefits, specifically looking at the actual packaging. Apparently, there's different requirements for packaging between provinces, but generally speaking, it's not going to have too much of an impact. Really, their important focus is actually looking at trade engagement and making sure that there's actually a labor force, sorry, is what I meant to say, a labor force that is available to help them in actually developing these products. So tools and specifications. So that was all having to do specifically with EPD processes, specifically with manufacturers. But now we're going to now sort of see the actual overlaps between the manufacturers themselves with the public and private industry discussions sort of overlaid and filtered on top. But you can see, generally speaking, that, again, there was an agreement as it relates to specifications being key to decarbonization. Again, really very, very important to be able to highlight. A lot of us are working on specifications these days. I know our office specifically at CIRCOR is. It's an ongoing process, an ongoing investigation, and it's been incredibly enlightening. And one thing that I certainly encourage among other engineers and or architects is to really dive into your specifications. Super important. The challenges that are being associated with it is what the actual wording and verbiage is within your Division 1, right? To be able to identify what those specific requests are and how we actually integrate the EPD as part of the request within your Division 1. This is also really important to be able to highlight current and accurate data information. A lot of the manufacturers were talking about how if there were any specifications, not only is it very prescriptive, again, we'll speak about that in a minute, but it's also not necessarily using current information. So our job as the private sector representatives, when we're actually outlining specifics within our specifications, that we need to ensure that we're using current and accurate information. Quick note as it relates to life cycle stages, manufacturers were actually also concerned that the whole building life cycle assessments for products was not taken into account. So this sort of pairs back with EPD comparability, EPD limitations, right? So they were concerned that the entire scope, life cycle scope of the product is not being assessed. It's only being looked at the upfront stage. This is really important because some are of the camp and thought that it's really important to look at the entirety of the life cycle, but it's also, there's others that are actually focused in on the upfront. So my suggestion would be to actually look at both. And as a private sector representative, as an architect, I'm required to be able to educate our developers and or clients to ensure that they're aware of what those limitations are. So something to keep in mind. This was also quite an interesting discussion. There was one particular manufacturer that noted in the conference to say, the moment private sector and public sector representatives commit to their decarbonization goals, that's the day I will make an EPD. There's no argument. There's nothing that can be said because what the gentleman was saying was correct. There's always this notion of the decarbonization goals. There's always the actual objectives for meeting them, but oftentimes what ends up happening is it gets either value engineered out or the costing is too much, or quite literally, it does not actually get executed on site. So this verification, this commitment needs to be ensured from beginning to end, because we as the private sector representatives, as well as public sector representatives, need to be able to ensure and highlight to manufacturers that we are in fact committed to what we're actually what our actual goals are with regards to decarbonization. So it's really very important to be able to do that. And again, every member, practically every single person in the room stated quite clearly that there was an agreement that early engagement is needed. It is actually critical to the processes because that makes sure that your communication of the objectives of the project early are communicated through to the team and then implemented at the end of the day. That communication chain, that engagement chain needs to happen and needs to happen consistently. There was also consensus among the private sector representatives that education of trades and contractors are critical. We need to engage with them early. We need to outline the actual requirements of the objectives for decarbonization on site. What are the embodied carbon objectives that we need to meet? And how does that actually translate? So this early engagement and this education for both trades and contractors was a key piece. The sort of challenges that we were finding is that a lot of the manufacturers who wanted to participate in design assist were finding that private sector representatives were not interested. Meanwhile, at the same time, quite literally, private sector representatives were saying manufacturers they have reached out to were not interested in design assist, so there's nobody that they can pull into the discussion early. Again, simultaneously, builders were saying, we are the guys that you can call to bridge the gap between private sector and manufacturers, but we're never called early, we're always called late. So clearly there's a bit of an issue with regards to communication, with regards to engagement, with regards to dedication, and frankly, with regards to ensuring that objectives are being met. And I can tell you honestly, everybody is really wanting to be able to do these things. I think part of the discussion is being able to communicate that out amongst one another. So bringing your builders in early, talking with the manufacturers early and saying, look, we might not be able to attain you at the end of the day. We want to have that flexibility, but we want to have this conversation. Benefits to the manufacturers, you've got a prospective client potentially that you can actually get the project for, but also you're building relationships amongst the private sector. That is huge. Utilize that and make that as an opportunity for you to be a knowledge leader within your respective scope and within your respective industry. Integrated project delivery was also a really important key piece in discussion to this. We talk about it all the time. We hear about it in the reports. We hear about it in the lectures, but there's never really an opportunity to actually implement it. It's getting better. I can say from a lot of the projects that we're working on, IPD is actually becoming more and more common. However, if there's an opportunity to be able to reinforce that with other clients and teams, let's do it. So I want to be able to quickly breeze through these next few slides. I'm just mindful of our time, Anya, so I'm going to try and pick up the pace here. But project LCAs is really important because we talked about product LCAs just as it relates to informing the EPDs, but we haven't really talked about project LCAs. Project LCAs is important because it's actually identifying what the actual carbon value is of your project. So ensuring that actual carbon reporting is being done. And usually that's something that you submit not just to the client who maybe has decarbonization goals, but also as part of your applications for site plan, et cetera. So it's again outlined in policy. So again, there's an agreement that LCA needs to be done, but there's an agreement specifically that it needs to be done to ensure that the verification process happens, that what we've actually set up at the beginning of a project is in fact implemented and built at the end of the day. On site. So what does that actually mean? And it requires you to be able to develop a real-time LCA, meaning as you go throughout the project, you're doing your life cycle assessment, not just through design, not just through the schematic design and design development, but specifically as it relates to your construction documents. So there was discussions about building permit stage LCA. There was also discussions as it relates to at site, like as built rather, as it relates to developing a life cycle assessment at that time. So really at occupancy, and then also maybe even doing a real-time LCA maybe in 5 years after the project has been completed, and depending on the ownership, maybe another couple of years thereafter in 10, 20 period life cycle stages, phasing. Tender and procurement was another important discussion, just as it relates to being ensuring that through the use of specifications and trades and contractor engagement and communication, that the actual carbon goals outlined in your project is being communicated through the tender process. Quick notes as it relates to communication and education for both policy and as well as private sector perspectives and participants is, again, all sectors, including the levels of government, agreed that there needs to be extensive communication and education for all involved in the process. And that doesn't necessarily mean the general public, which one of our attendees mentioned that sustainability is the best kept secret. I frankly agree. But it's really important to be able to ensure that that communication about what those goals are from a policy standpoint are being communicated to the public, but specifically to other departments in the city. So there is a lot of discussion about alignment of what those goals are. And in fact, some municipal representatives noted that there is a sort of a discrepancy in alignment as it relates to specific city departments versus other city departments, just as it relates to aligning those for those decarbonization goals. Provincial participation was also key to this. Synergies, guys, we're almost done. We have a few more slides left. Synergies was really a very important discussion here. There needs to be a sort of processes to ensure that these policy and legislation of that decarbonization goals actually gets implemented in a feasible and in a balanced and aligned way. I sort of touched on that in the previous slide, but I think the key point is that everybody was in agreement on this, including actual public sector representatives. Manufacturers also agreed that yes, in fact, policy and legislation is a tool to ensure decarbonization happens. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation. Super important and very encouraging. So there was discussions about, you know, aligning the GSs or green development standards or other policy requirements, just as it relates to mandatory versus voluntary tiers or matrices. They also wanted greater clarity. They, manufacturers and even private sector representatives, actually wanted a little bit more clarity as it relates to the timelines for legislation. But also I want to just quickly touch on as it relates to the targets and the embodied versus operational. There was also discussion about balancing operational with embodied as well as with health and well-being to ensure that all those components are being factored in. A lot of the discussions that we've had with some of the sustainability experts were saying that operational carbon will come at the cost of embodied and vice versa. It's usually not something that you can kind of balance out together. And if it is, it may not necessarily meet the specific targets outlined in policy. So that discussion needs to be assessed. But at the end of the day, this isn't just a numbers game. These are people that are going to be living in this building. This is about the health of our planet. So understanding what that health and well-being is as it relates to those targets needs to be implemented. So super quick, this is sort of the last particular slide as it relates to the challenges and opportunities or the findings, is again looking at that risk and resiliency. It's focusing in on addressing housing affordability concurrently with and aligned with your decarbonization goals. So a lot of discussions that we've had around this was actually brought on through our workshop session at the end of the conference, really the focusing in on what that innovation is, how we can actually look at a more performance pathway versus a prescriptive pathway. So instead of setting targets for embodied carbon legislation for specifically structure, for specifically envelope, there's maybe other ways in which we can actually get to these decarbonization goals through other means. So creating that flexibility was really a critical piece. Again, focusing in on building design and typology, recognizing that there's different ownerships, sort of strategies, rental versus condo. What does that mean as it relates to what those carbon goals are and how they're actually executed? And again, super quickly, I want to be able to identify that there was also discussions as it relates to adaptive reuse and what those recycling roadblocks are. How do we ensure that that recycling process actually continues and in a more cost-effective way so that it can be amplified and continued at scale? The other important piece that I want to be able to highlight is material scope, going beyond structure and envelope. Let's talk about MEP. Let's talk about other materials within the actual interiors potentially, etc. The other important piece is about bio-based materials. It's really important to know that a lot of these bio-based materials are important and contributing factors to embodied carbon reduction, but a lot of them, again, in our investigations in the lead up to this particular conference, is that a lot of these bio-based materials don't necessarily meet the actual testing and co-compliance that would allow you to be able to utilize them for things like a Part 3 building, where you can actually build it out at scale. So some of the concerns that were brought on by a number of the participants as well was about the structural integrity, the potential for decomposition, guaranteed performance, and then availability and fire testing. So these were just a few of the things that were brought up. Some quick takeaways. There was a lot of stuff discussed today. It was jam-packed, and I hope you all enjoyed it very much. But I think the key important things are really looking at the understanding the importance of EPDs and communicating that through to the team, but specifically engaging with manufacturers. Manufacturers have such an important role in this embodied carbon map. Honestly, they're critical. So engage with them, learn from them, understand what those challenges are, try and find ways to help them if at all possible, if that means showing them to a particular resources. If you know a third-party verifier, recommend a third-party verifier, and just understanding what that process is will help ensure that that communication is consistent and that we're understanding as a whole, holistic point of view, what those challenges actually are. Understand your specifications. That can be a tool for decarbonization. If you're in the private sector like me, utilize it. Commitment and verification. If you're in the private sector and you're wanting to be able to ensure that what you've actually set out at the beginning of a project is being implemented on site, look into real-time LCAs. And I would actually say this to public sector representatives too. If there's something that you think needs to be added or enhanced for your green development standards, if we're talking municipally, consider verification. I think it's really important to be able to highlight that. And again, private sector representatives who are building these buildings, who are submitting these projects for approvals, we're saying verification is the key to ensure that those net zero or near zero goals that are being set out by all these green development standards are in fact being implemented. I do want to also be able to highlight quite quickly the notion about the prescriptive versus performance pathways. If you're an authority having jurisdiction, think about that. What does that mean? And how that can inform your green development standard, but also just as it relates to understanding what that threshold between embodied and operational is. That was a key discussion in the conference and something that needs to potentially be studied or assessed in greater detail. So we started off with the notion of holistic strategies, and I think at the end of the day, the discussions that we've had really allowed us to map out what those holistic strategies are, ensuring that each and every single one of those challenges and opportunities, I think it's really important to highlight both, were actually identified at the conference, were identified in the research and engagement before the conference, after the conference, and I can say as a rep for the Carbon Coalition, we are very excited to continue the conversation, to engage furthermore with CLF, with CAGBC, and with other industry manufacturers, private sector reps, public sector reps, to continue the conversation. So with that, Anya, I've beat my time. We do have a couple minutes to spare, so looking forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, jam-packed session with a lot of information. Thank you very much for sharing. I feel like there's really been a lot of takeaways from just the conference that you had and kind of everything that you've been presenting here. The graphic is fascinating. There is one question in the chat from Samantha, and the question is, are you planning on having another coalition this year?
I'm going to say tentatively, but we're not there yet. The planning process has not happened yet, but we're hoping to be able to have, if not annual conferences, we're hoping to be able to open it up at least as a biannual. And because this was our first conference, it was a sort of a limited scope of group of people, but we're hoping to be able to open that up to everybody as well. So Samantha, definitely would love to have you join us as well in the next one. So stay tuned for that. We'll see what happens.
And I think we're just going to take one more question that's coming from Michelle. Who is part of the coalition, and is there a specific vision for the coalition?
Thanks, Michelle. Good to hear from you. The coalition is really open to all. So really, honestly, if there's an opportunity that you think there might be to be able to participate, we'd love to be able to have you join us. It's open to everybody from industry manufacturers, from public sector, from private sector representatives. So really, again, ensuring that there's that holistic discussion. And that sort of pairs in with what our actual mission and vision is, to be able to develop those holistic strategies for decarbonization, for reducing embodied carbon in buildings. And that's really fundamentally being derived from all that engagement with each of those particular sector representatives. Again, a lot of the discussions that we've had, as you saw on the map there, and as you saw, almost majority of the conversation within the actual presentation is being driven by industry manufacturers. So I think, if anything, that's really where our sort of focus is on, and really where our niche comes into play, is ensuring that manufacturers have that fundamental role and voice at the table. That's really the key point that we want to be able to convey. But yeah, that's where we're at. So we're very excited about it and hope to be able to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Lara. I know we're at 1 p.m., so we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for sharing all this information. I'm sure there was a lot of heavy lifting between organizing the event and all the takeaways and the reporting that you're preparing now. Thank you for your leadership in the embodied carbon space. We looking forward to your next steps and potentially next events. So for CLF, we have, as I mentioned, 2 events coming up in May. So hope to see some of the participants in that session as well. Thank you for everyone that participated, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Anya. Bye-bye.